They say the dead do not speak, but I think they simply wait until someone is listening closely enough. I had just transferred to the night shift in the ICU after 3 years of rotating days. Nights were quieter, slower, and carried a stillness that made everything feel more distant. The patients were mostly stable or sedated, and with the fluorescent lights dimmed low, the ward often felt like a suspended world between sleep and death. That was when I met room 5. The patient was a middle-aged man in a coma. After a severe stroke, he had been there for months, unresponsive, yet strangely stable, no signs of recovery, but also no deterioration. Nurses came and went, some left a little shaken, saying the room gave them a strange feeling. I never believed in such things. I trusted vitals and lab results, not superstitions, but I began to notice something odd. Every time I entered room 5 during the deep hours of the night, when the halls were silent and the machines hummed like lullabies, I felt this chill, not on my skin, but somewhere inside my chest, like a presence brushing past. It started on a rainy Tuesday. I was alone in the hallway, checking charts, when I heard a soft hiss behind me. I turned, expecting to find someone. No one. The hallway was empty, the kind of empty that makes your ears ring from the silence. I shook it off. Maybe a door had shifted from the wind, but then I heard it again, barely there. A whispering sound coming from room 5. I stepped inside. The man on the bed hadn't moved an inch. The ventilator rhythmically hissed and exhaled, but beneath that, there it was again, whispering. I leaned closer to the machine. It was faint, like someone breathing words through the mechanical sighs. My hands went cold as I stared at the monitors. Perfectly normal, no spike in brain activity, nothing to explain what I was hearing. I stepped back, heart pounding. Maybe I was overtired. I left the room, but that night, I barely slept, and the whisper stayed in my ears long after I went home. The next night, the whispers returned. I stood by the ventilator, holding my breath. This time, I tried to listen carefully. It was not just noise, it was a name, over and over, soft and almost pleading. I could not make it out completely, but it sounded like Dr. Mera. I frowned. There had not been a Dr. Mera in the ICU in years, at least not on the current staff. Still, the name gnawed at me. I asked around the next evening during shift change, trying to sound casual. An older nurse, Shalini, paused when I mentioned it. She looked at me, serious and quiet. She said Dr. Mera used to work in the ICU long ago. Respected, brilliant, always calm. But something changed in his last year. He began working late nights alone, refusing to take breaks, often seen talking to patients who were unresponsive. One morning, they found him in room 5. He had hung himself from the curtain rail. It was ruled suicide, but no one ever really talked about why. The hospital never reassigned room 5 as anything else. It stayed an ICU bed. I tried to laugh it off. Coincidences, stress, echoes of stories retold over time. But that night, I brought my phone. I waited until the whispering started. I placed the phone near the ventilator and stepped outside the room, watching the monitors from the hallway. No changes. When I returned after 10 minutes and played back the recording, my heart stopped, clearer than I expected. The voice repeated again and again. Dr. Mera, help call, cannot breathe. Dr. Mera, over and over, until my hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped the phone. The voice was not the patient's. It was too young, too desperate, and worse. I knew it. It was a voice I had heard only once before, during a CPR training video narrated by Dr. Mera himself. I could not stop trembling. That night, I left early, making some excuse about feeling sick, but I knew I would have to return. Over the next week, the voice became stronger. The patient's condition remained unchanged, but the ventilator sounded more and more human. The whispers began even when I was not in the room. One night, while checking a chart across the hall, I heard a sharp, choking gasp. I rushed in, but the man's vitals were perfectly steady. The nurse beside me looked at me like I had imagined it. I knew something in that room was alive in a way that should not have been. I finally played the recording for Shalini, her face drained of color. She nodded slowly, told me there was one more thing she had never told anyone. Before his death, Dr. Mehra had been obsessed with one theory, that sometimes coma patients were not unconscious at all, but trapped inside their minds, fully aware, fully helpless. He believed the mind could call out, not with brain waves or movement, but through energy, through machine. Everyone called him unstable after that. But what if he was right? What if, in trying to prove it, he went too far? The last night I ever worked in that ICU, I entered room 5 at 3 a.m. I had to see him to look him in the face and ask what he wanted. As I stood there, the whispers grew louder, almost angry. The ventilator shook slightly, though the reading stayed the same. I asked aloud, "What do you want?" The machine hissed once more, and then silence. The monitors went flat. For the first time in months, the man's heart stopped. We tried to resuscitate him. Nothing worked. But as we covered the body, I saw something that made my breath catch. On the inside of the ventilator tube, written in condensation, was a message: "Help him, Dr. Mehra." It was not my imagination. Shalini saw it too. The next day, room 5 was sealed off for maintenance, and they quietly reassigned the space to storage. No one spoke of the patient again. But I kept the recordings. Sometimes I still play them, just to remind myself it was real. The voice is fainter now, but it is still there, and every time I hear it, I wonder how many others are still waiting, trapped in their silent prisons, whispering through the machines, hoping someone finally listens. Hospitals are supposed to be places of healing, but there are corners in some buildings that seem untouched by recovery. In our ICU, it was room 308. At first glance, it looked like any other room. Same pale green walls, same monitor hum, same antiseptic smell, but something about it always felt off. New nurses were never assigned there on their first week. The more experienced ones swapped shifts just to avoid it. The strange thing was, every patient admitted into that room showed signs of improvement. They got better. Their charts were clean, vitals stabilized, and families even started planning homecoming meals. But none of those patients ever made it to the discharge papers. Either they died suddenly, without warning, or they simply disappeared, not discharged, not transferred, just gone. The strangest part, when I checked the records one night out of curiosity, I found something no one had mentioned aloud. No patient from room 308 had ever walked out alive in over 5 years. It started bothering me more than it should have. I began paying closer attention during my night shifts, especially when room 308 was occupied. Sometimes I would pass by and notice small things that made no medical sense. The ECG monitor would dip for a moment, and then return to normal. Even when the patient showed no signs of distress, the IV machine would beep, not in alarm, but like it was reacting to something unseen. And then there were the whispers. I heard them faintly, not from the patients, but from within the room itself, like a distant voice trying to speak through layers of air. I asked a few colleagues, and they either brushed it off or looked away, as if pretending it was nothing would keep it from being real. But one senior nurse, Leela, once whispered to me during a coffee break, "Room 308 doesn't let go. It holds on, even after the body is gone." One night, I had a patient named Samir, 34, recovering from a minor surgery after a burst appendix. He was healthy, upbeat, making jokes with the staff, already requesting street food once discharged. He was placed in room 308, only because the rest of the ICU was full. I stayed a little later that night, something pulling at me, telling me to check on him one more time before I left. When I reached the room, Samir was awake, staring at the ceiling with wide, terrified eyes. I asked him what was wrong, but he wouldn't speak, just kept shaking his head like he was trying to say no to something I couldn't see. The monitors were fine, no spikes, no drops, but the air felt heavy, too heavy to breathe in comfortably.
I stayed there for a while until his breathing calmed. He finally whispered, "There's something under the bed." I thought he was hallucinating from medication, but I still knelt down and checked. There was nothing visible at least. But I swear the shadow under the bed didn't move the way it should. When I tilted my head, it shifted too, delayed, like it was deciding how to follow. I stood up and said we were transferring him to another room. He looked relieved for a second, but then the power flickered. Just in that room, Samir gasped and grabbed my arm so tight his nails broke my skin. The machine started beeping wildly. His heart rate spiked, then dropped, then flatlined, all within 30 seconds. We rushed to perform CPR, but it was like something was pressing down on him, like an invisible weight holding his chest. We couldn't bring him back. The doctors ruled it a sudden cardiac event. I knew it was not. After that, I became obsessed. I spent one of my off nights digging through old physical archives in the basement, looking through handwritten notes and shift logs from before everything was digitized. That was when I came across a pattern even more disturbing. Room 308 used to be numbered 317, before the East Wing renovations 10 years ago. Back then too, unexplained deaths were common, same vague causes, same sudden vanishing. There was even a note written in the margins of a nurse's report from 1992 that said, "Tell the new staff not to let anyone sleep 3 full nights in 317. That's when it begins. Begins what? The report didn't say, just that line. I brought it to my supervisor. She told me not to repeat it, and warned me to stop looking into old records. When I asked why, she said, "Because that room notices when someone's watching it too closely." I thought about quitting. I should have, but something inside me needed to know what was happening. My last shift in that hospital came when room 308 went empty for a full week. That never happened, not even once. I should have felt relieved, but instead, I felt a pit open in my stomach. On my final night, I did something foolish. I entered room 308 alone, without a patient, and sat on the edge of the bed with the lights off, just to see. For a few minutes, nothing happened. Then I heard footsteps, not from the hall, but from under the bed, slow, dragging footsteps that circled the bed without ever showing a body. I couldn't move. I couldn't even scream. Something brushed the back of my neck, cold and wet like fingers pulled from deep water. I ran. I didn't finish my shift. I didn't even clean out my locker. I just left. A week later, I checked the hospital directory out of curiosity. Room 308 had been renumbered again. Now it was room 30. New paint, new curtains, same door, and a new patient already listed. Stable condition. I never followed up again. Some nights, I still wake up at exactly 3:08 AM, sweating, feeling like someone is watching me from just behind the shadows. I keep all my bedroom lights on now. I never let them go off, not even for a second, because I know now what that room is. It is not cursed. It is hungry. It waits in silence. It chooses carefully, and it never discharges.
There are places in the world that make your skin crawl the moment you step into them. Hospitals, especially ICU wards, have a certain kind of eerie silence, as if something unnatural lingers just behind the sterile walls. ICU nurses have stories that will make you look at a hospital bed differently, and one particular tale has haunted the halls of the ward for years. It's not just a story, it's something that left scars, not on the patients, but on the nurses who worked there. The tale of the never discharged patient is one that no nurse at St. Michael's Hospital ever wanted to be a part of. It all began with a small detail that no one thought much of at first. A shadow. Nurses working late shifts, preparing for their rounds, noticed a strange flickering shadow behind the curtain of one of the beds. It wasn't the kind of shadow that moved because of passing lights or shifting objects. No, it was something far stranger. The shadow would sway gently, like it was alive. It wasn't the shadow of a patient or any nurse. It had no shape, no form. It was just a presence. At first it was dismissed. Hospitals are busy, stressful places, and maybe, just maybe, the nurses had been overworked. But then they started noticing something else.
Every time they walked past that bed, the shadow would seem to watch them. It was always there, always moving. Never a person behind it, never anything that could be explained. One night, Nurse Alina, who had been working at St. Michael's for over 5 years, was assigned to the night shift. As usual, the ward was quiet, and everything was calm. But that shadow, the one behind the curtain, made her uneasy. She would pass it every time she made her rounds, but she never dared to pull back the curtain to investigate, not because she was afraid, but because there was something in the air about that bed, something wrong. That night, however, was different. Alina was on her own, and she couldn't ignore the feeling creeping up her spine. As she approached the bed with the curtain drawn tightly around it, she paused. The shadow was moving again, like a slow rhythmic sway, as if someone or something was standing behind it, shifting in place. Alina tried to shake off the unease. She had seen her fair share of odd things in her time as a nurse, but this felt different. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as she walked closer. The curtain, as though beckoning her, seemed to ripple with the movements from within. Alina couldn't help herself. She reached for the curtain, her fingers brushing against the cold fabric. Her heart raced, the beat pounding in her chest, as she slowly, hesitantly, pulled it back. What she saw in that bed was something she could never unsee. There, under the pale light of the ICU, the bed was empty, completely empty. No patient, no nurse, no one at all. Yet, the shadow was still moving. It shifted across the empty bed, stretching and bending, as if it had a life of its own. The room grew colder, the air thick with a presence that was unmistakably wrong. It was then that Alina realized the horrifying truth. This shadow wasn't just a trick of light. It wasn't a hallucination. It was something much darker. Something that had been in the hospital far longer than any patient. The room seemed to close in on her. She could feel her breath catch in her throat, and every instinct told her to run. But she could. Her feet felt as though they were stuck in place. Her eyes locked onto the bed, and that's when she heard it. The sound of faint labored breathing, coming from the corner of the room. She turned, her gaze flicking toward the noise. But there was no one there. No patient, no movement, just the oppressive silence, thick and suffocating. She finally found the strength to tear her eyes away from the empty bed, and her hand shot out to grab the phone on the nearby table. As she dialed for help, her thoughts raced. What was happening? Who was behind the curtain? Why had no one else ever noticed the shadow? Was it possible that the patient had never actually left the hospital? Was it even a patient at all? When the doctors arrived, the air seemed to shift. They entered the room, a few nurses trailing behind them, and Alina explained everything she had seen and heard. They all exchanged uneasy glances, as though they already knew something they weren't saying. The head doctor, Dr. Patel, motioned for the others to leave, leaving him alone with Alina. His expression was grave, as he asked her to sit. He told her the history of that bed, the history of the patient who had once occupied it. Years ago, a patient had been admitted to St. Michael's with a severe, unexplainable condition. They had been there for months. No family, no visitors, nothing but the sterile confines of the ICU. The patient had been bedridden, with no signs of improvement. Doctors had given up hope, but they couldn't bring themselves to discharge him. There was something about him that kept the staff coming back. But as time went on, the patient's condition worsened, and then one night, he died. Or at least, that's what they thought. The records showed that the patient had passed away in his sleep, his heart simply stopping without warning. But they never removed his bed. They never took the patient's belongings from the room. Something about the entire situation felt unfinished. Dr. Patel's voice was low, his tone heavy with dread. He explained that the patient's death had been a lie. The man had never left the hospital. His spirit had remained, trapped in the ICU, wandering between the curtains of the beds, waiting. The shadow that Alina had seen, that was him. The spirit of the never-discharged patient, forever lingering in that bed, never leaving. As Alina listened, a chill ran down her spine. She turned to the empty bed, the curtains still swaying slightly, as though something was still there just beyond the fabric. It was then that the terrifying reality hit her. She had seen it. The shadow had been watching her, and it had been waiting for someone to uncover the truth, waiting for someone to acknowledge its existence. The next morning, Alina didn't show up for her shift. The staff tried calling her, but there was no answer. They went to her apartment, but it was locked. No sign of her, no trace, nothing. Her colleagues assumed she was simply too shaken by the night's event. But a few days later, a note was found on her desk, written in a trembling hand. "I saw it. I shouldn't have opened the curtain. It won't let me leave." To this day, no one knows what happened to Nurse Alina. Some say she left the hospital in fear, never to return. Others believe she became another part of the shadow, another lost soul trapped in the ICU ward, forever watching from behind the curtains. The story of the never-discharged patient is still told by ICU nurses, whispered between shifts. Some believe it's just a story, a warning to be cautious of what lies behind the curtains. But others know the truth. In that hospital, some patients never truly leave, and neither do their shadow.
I never thought I would fear the ICU, but after what happened, I can't step foot inside without feeling that cold, oppressive dread.
Those were the words of my colleague Ashir, who had worked in the ICU for over 10 years. Ashir was the calm, level-headed type, the one who could always be counted on during the most intense moments, but even she couldn't shake what happened that night. And honestly, after hearing her story, neither could I. It started like any other evening shift. The ICU was its usual mix of chaos and calm, the hum of machines, the occasional beep of a monitor. I had just finished checking on my assigned patients, and was about to grab a cup of coffee, when something unusual caught my attention. In one of the rooms, I saw a figure standing by the bedside, his back facing me. He was tall, with a patient gown hanging loosely on his frame. His face was pale, but there was something unsettling about the way he stood. I thought it was odd, but nothing out of the ordinary for the ICU. Patients often stood in odd positions, sometimes lost in their own dazed states. I approached, thinking I would check on him, but before I could reach the door, I noticed something strange. The patient's name wasn't listed in the room log. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. A quick glance at the patient chart on the wall confirmed it. There was no name. I started to feel the first prickles of discomfort. I took a deep breath, walked into the room, and approached the patient. "Sir, are you all right?" I asked gently, my voice trembling slightly. He didn't respond. I reached for his shoulder, giving it a soft shake, and when I turned him around, I nearly jumped back. His face was a blank canvas, completely devoid of expression, as though he was frozen in place. And then, just like that, his eyes snapped open, wide, but without any life behind them. A chill ran through me. There was something wrong, something deeply wrong, about this man. Without wasting any more time, I rushed out of the room and went straight to the nurse's station. My heart was racing. I checked the patient log again, just to make sure I hadn't missed something earlier. No, there was no record of the man in the room. I turned to the others at the station, asking if anyone knew who he was, but none of them knew. Everyone was just as confused as I was. My instincts told me to go back, to check on the man once more, but the unease gnawed at me. Something in the pit of my stomach told me that I wasn't dealing with a normal patient. I called Ashir, who had more experience than anyone in the unit. I told her about the man, about how he wasn't on the list, about how his eyes seemed to follow me when I left the room. Ashir was quiet for a moment before she responded, her voice low, almost as if she didn't want anyone else to hear. There's something you need to know. Listen carefully. Don't go back in that room alone. She paused again, then said, that man, he died 10 days ago. I felt my blood run cold at her words. What? But I just saw him. He's alive, or at least he looks like he is. I'm telling you, he's not alive. He died 10 days ago. We all thought he was going to pull through, but he didn't. I was one of the last people to see him. His family was devastated when we told them. We had him listed as deceased in the records. His body was even taken away. I couldn't comprehend what I was hearing. Was it possible? I had just seen a ghost. The idea seemed insane, but the fear inside me was undeniable. Still, I couldn't shake the thought of the man standing in that room, unmoving, staring with those unblinking eyes. Ashir warned me again not to go back in, but I couldn't help myself. I had to know what was happening. I went back to the room, my steps slow and deliberate. The air in the ICU was thick with tension, and the silence felt suffocating. When I reached the door, I hesitated for a moment before pushing it open, but this time I wasn't prepared for what I would find. The room was empty. The man was gone. There were no signs of him. No trace. No evidence that he had ever been there. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. I rushed back to the nurse's station, my hands shaking. He's gone. The room was empty. I don't understand. Where did he go? I asked the other nurses, my voice cracking. But as I looked around, something in the air felt different. The usual hum of the ICU seemed quieter, almost too quiet. I asked about the room's CCTV footage, wanting to see what had happened. The footage was pulled up, and we all gathered around the screen, the tension thick in the air. The cameras had captured me, entering the room, approaching the bed. I could see myself clearly in the footage, but there was no man standing by the bed. The room was completely empty. I felt a wave of nausea hit me as the screen flickered, showing me alone in the room. Reaching out to touch the empty space where the patient had been standing, the man had never been there. It was as if he had been erased. But then something even more unsettling happened. A strange static noise came from the speakers. We rewound the footage, but there it was again, the figure of the man, standing by the bed for just a split second, before disappearing once more. The footage wasn't corrupted. It was clear, but the man had never been there physically. He had never been there at all. Ashir's words echoed in my head. He died 10 days ago, but why had I seen him? Why had I been so sure that he was there? The answer, when it came, was far worse than I could have ever imagined. It wasn't just that the patient had died, it was that he had never been discharged. He had never left the ICU. Not in any real sense. His body had been taken, but his presence, his spirit, had lingered. He wasn't a ghost. He was something worse, something trapped between life and death, unable to fully let go. And I had witnessed it. I had seen the never discharged patient, caught in a world that wasn't his own, still clinging to the remnants of life that he would never return to. The next day, when I checked the records again, I found the entry for that patient. He was listed as discharged, but it was a mistake. The records had been altered. The staff had forgotten about him, his name erased from memory, as if he had never truly existed. But I knew the truth. The never discharged patient was still out there, somewhere in the ICU waiting, and I would never forget the cold, lifeless eyes that had followed me, even when I couldn't see him.
It was around midnight when Nurse Priya sat at her station, the hum of the ICU monitors surrounding her like a steady heartbeat. The low light flickered, intermittently, casting long shadows against the walls of the sterile, quiet room. She had been working the night shift for almost a year, and like most nurses, she had grown accustomed to the eerie silence that blanketed the ward when the world outside slept. Priya was used to the sounds of beeping monitors, the quiet whispers of her colleagues, and the occasional groan of a patient in distress. But there was one sound, one particular beep, that always made her skin crawl. It wasn't the usual beeping of a heart rate monitor or the faint rattle of a ventilator. No, it was the shrill, sudden spike that came from a specific monitor in the corner of the room. The monitor never seemed to have a patient connected to it, but every night at the same time, it would emit a loud red spike. It was as though the machine was warning them of something she couldn't explain. It was subtle at first, but Priya noticed it more and more. As time went on, it was like the spike appeared at the exact moment a patient would pass away. She'd seen it happen before. A nurse in the ward, a few weeks back, had been the first to mention it, almost jokingly. Every time that monitor spikes, someone dies, she had said, laughing it off as a coincidence. Priya had dismissed it as nothing more than superstition. After all, this was a hospital, and strange things happened here all the time. People lived, people died. It was part of the cycle of life. But then the pattern began to reveal itself more clearly. Every time that monitor emitted a sharp red spike, the death of a patient seemed to follow. At first, Priya thought it was a fluke, but after weeks of watching, she started to wonder if there was something more to it. One night, after a particularly exhausting shift, Priya decided to track the spikes. She took note of the time. Every time the monitor would emit that same ominous red peak, it was always at the same hour, 3:17 a.m. Every single time, and within 1 minute of the spike, a patient in the ICU would slip away, their heart stopping without warning. Priya couldn't explain it. It wasn't as if the patients were in critical condition or expected to die. In fact, some of them had been improving, some had been expected to make a full recovery. The more she watched, the more uneasy she felt. The patients that had died were not all on the verge of death. They weren't all in comas, nor were they all terminal cases. Some had been as healthy as any other patient in the ward, only to have their heart stop seconds after the spike. Priya began to track the times with a notebook, crossing off names of patients she had noticed had died after the spikes. She couldn't make sense of it, but the pattern was undeniable. She started to feel like she was living in a nightmare, one that she couldn't escape. A few more nights passed, and Priya felt herself growing increasingly paranoid. She couldn't shake the feeling that the red spike wasn't just a coincidence, that it was something more sinister. One evening, as the clock struck 3:17 a.m. once again, Priya felt her breath catch in her throat. The monitor in the corner blinked, and then, with a sudden burst of sound, the red spike shot straight up. A cold chill ran down her spine. She glanced over at the nearest patient, an elderly man named Mr. Singh, who had been recovering from a stroke. He was stable, breathing steadily. She thought about the strange occurrence of the monitor. She looked at the time again. 3:18 a.m. It had happened again. She quickly scanned the room, but this time, something was different. The room felt colder, darker. It was as though the shadows had deepened in the corners, swallowing up the light from the monitors. The atmosphere felt heavy, as though something was watching her. Priya glanced back at Mr. Singh. His breathing had stopped. A knot twisted in her stomach. She felt a surge of panic rise in her chest, and for a moment, her mind was filled with questions. Was it the monitor? Was it just a fluke? Or was something more sinister at play? She ran to Mr. Singh's side, checking his pulse, but it was no use. He was gone. For a moment, she felt like she was trapped in a nightmare. But then, something even more horrifying happened. As she reached for the phone to call the doctor, Priya heard a voice. It wasn't coming from anyone in the room, and yet it was unmistakable. The voice was faint, almost a whisper, but it sent a chill down her spine. "Help me," it said. And then, "It's too late." Priya turned, her heart racing, but the room was empty. She was alone. The voice, it seemed to echo in the silence of the ICU, and as it did,
The monitor next to Mr. Singh beeped once more. Another red spike. A feeling of dread washed over her. It wasn't the first time she'd heard strange things in the hospital. There were always stories of restless souls, of patients who never truly left. But Priya had never believed them. Now, standing in the dark, the eerie voice still lingering in her mind, she began to wonder if there was some truth to the legend. Her thoughts were interrupted by the shrill sound of the monitor again. This time, it was connected to her. The same red spike blared, and Priya froze. She stared at it in disbelief, her hands trembling. No, it couldn't be. She wasn't supposed to be next. But there it was. The monitor had spiked at 3:17 a.m. And then, at exactly 3:18 a.m., Priya's heart began to race. The red spike was clear now. She wasn't just observing, she was part of the pattern. As the seconds ticked by, her vision began to blur, and the cold feeling in the room seemed to envelop her. A sharp pain seized her chest. She gasped, trying to call for help. But it was too late. The last thing Priya heard before everything went dark was the voice again. It's too late. The monitors blinked one last time. At exactly 3:18 a.m., Nurse Priya became the next patient on the list. No one knows what happened to the monitor after that. But to this day, the ICU still has the same eerie pattern. The red spike at 3:17 a.m., followed by death, continues on. And every nurse who works there knows one thing: if that monitor spikes, you're already too late.